Hello, and happy Halloween! Welcome back to Killershrewfan's Spooktacular Toy Reviews. Well, here we are. All Hallows Eve, truly the most spooktacular night of the year. And have I got a fun one for you today? Heads are gonna roll. Throughout the month, we've been looking at everything from carcasses and oddities to genetic monstrosities and all sorts of frightening creatures. But when it came time to decide how best to close out the series, my mind kept wandering back to those classic images of Halloween. And perhaps one of the most celebrated would be skeletons. There's something about this image of what lies beneath that makes us consider our own mortality. And because of that, the idea of this thing that remains after our death and is supposed to be long dead, getting up and moving around once again is extra frightening. Even outside of Halloween, skulls and bones are icons of celebrations involving death across the globe, proving that there's something about skeletons that just morbidly fascinates us. With this in mind, I felt the perfect way to celebrate Halloween would be through ending Killershrewfan's Spooktacular reviews with the REBOR Skull Oddity Collection. Plus, this way, you get 3 for the price of 1. Released in 2020, the first wave included the skulls of Carnotaurus, Ceratosaurus, and Yutyrannus. Of course, I acquired the Carnotaurus skull first, but recently picked up the other 2, so now I'm ready to tackle the entire wave, and it all starts right here and right now on Killershrewfan's Spooktacular Toy Reviews. But before we do that, we have to take a look at the boxes. The front face of each package features a profile image of the skull within, while the title of the line runs across the top and the name of the species in question can be found beneath the skull. The sides of the box contain additional images of the skulls, one at a slight angle, while the opposite side shows them from a head-on view. The back of the box plays as the usual REBOR catalog, showing what other skulls are available at the time of this wave's release. The top then features the REBOR logo, and something I like that they did here was that, in addition to their usual black box finish, REBOR has decked out the boxes with a sort of Victorian pattern and trim. The patterning might be hard to see under these lighting conditions, but it really gives the line a unique identity and one that adds to its gothic flair. And that's about all there is to the packaging of these pieces. Let's go ahead and get these bad boys out of their boxes. And here are the skulls, and all 3 of them look absolutely fantastic. It really does feel like REBOR has done their homework with these pieces and put in a lot of great effort to give us something that looks as though it was lifted straight out of a museum, albeit a little shrunk down. Right out of the gate, I must comment on the bases and an interesting disparity I've encountered. You can see that the left and right bases, the Ceratosaurus and Yutyrannus respectively, come with the mounting peg attached to the base itself, while the peg of the Carnotaurus display is fixed in the skull, and you mount it by placing the peg into the base. I don't know if this is the way things are for all the Carnotaurus skulls or the result of a change in the production runs. Like I said, I got the Carnotaurus right away, the other 2 waited, but I think I prefer the peg being attached to the base as opposed to the skull, as this allows you to display the skull without the base if you're so inclined, and also maybe recreate Shakespeare's Hamlet, like the theater nerd you are. The bases themselves are pretty straightforward, just an ornate, rounded wooden base stained a mahogany color. According to REBOR, it was cast from a Victorian-era antique candlestick holder. Not sure if that's true, but either way it adds that high-end look to the overall display without driving up costs to an exorbitant amount, so it's a win. Mounting the skulls is a simple matter of locating the hole in the roof of the mouth and then lining that up with the peg, and the skull will slide right on. Of course, this is for the Ceratosaurus and Yutyrannus. For the Carnotaurus, you just slide the peg into the opening of the base. But getting into the skulls themselves, we're going to start by taking a look at the Ceratosaurus. The skull is based off of the species dentisulcatus, and I think REBOR did an overall phenom job capturing the likeness here with that somewhat deeper snout and curved oral margins. Skulls are a little harder to get quote-unquote wrong, given that we have a set-in-stone, pun intended, image of what to to go off of. There's no question of soft tissue or speculative features. We know how this element of the animal looked, and therefore have no excuse to not capture it correctly. That being said, if so much as one contour is off, the whole thing is dead on arrival. Luckily, REBOR seemed to have nailed the forms here, at least insofar as I can tell. This is Ceratosaurus dentisulcatus, and I think any deviation in the big picture could be chalked up to variation among specimens. But then we get to the detail work, and man, oh man, did REBOR ever bring it here. Every little imperfection, every crack, every striation in the material, every uneven detail has been rendered, giving this piece a very natural and rocky appearance. I'm happy to see the foramina have been sculpted along the oral margins, and both the iconic nasal horn and lacrimal crests feature a cracked and rugose texture. Even the teeth feature hairline fractures and weathering, and the roof of the mouth has also been addressed. This is one of those reviews where I feel like I don't have to talk too much because the piece really just speaks for itself, so let's just take a moment to do some once-overs. Looking at the skull head-on, you can see that REBOR have captured that relatively narrow build of Ceratosaurus, but unfortunately mine seems to sport a somewhat offset jaw. I'm sure that's just luck of the draw, but speaking of the jaw, you do actually get some articulation with each of these pieces, and that's about all I need to do to show you how wonky the jaw on mine is. But anyway, here's a look at the sort of range of motion you can achieve with that articulation. It doesn't really like to stay fully open, nor does the sculpt allow it to close flush, but honestly, I'm surprised there's any motion accounted for at all with these pieces. I was fully expecting them to be static, but REBOR engineered them in a way that allows you some variation in display, which I always appreciate, so it's a nice little bonus. As far as the color goes, I really like the smoky gray tones REBOR have gone with here for the fossil. It makes it look like you're looking at a black and white photo of the holotype specimen. It's also light enough that you're able to see all of that detail, even at a distance. When it comes to the orbits, fenestra, and any other openings of the skull, these features have been filled in with a rocky cream substance. There's also a very light wash across the entire piece to help all of that rough detail really pop. As far as the size of the skull goes, you're looking at around 4.75 inches long or about 12 centimeters, and when on the base, the height is roughly the same, maybe closer to 5.25 inches off the ground or just past 13 centimeters. I couldn't find an exact measurement for the skull of Ceratosaurus dentisulcatus, but at 4.75 inches long, the model would have to reflect a whopping 28.5 inch skull to fit into a 1/6 scale range, which I swear is what REBOR advertised these as being, but I cannot seem to find a confirmation at this time. So please, if anyone out there knows either the advertised scale of these pieces or the size of dentisulcatus' skull, please let me know. For size comparison, I've gone ahead and brought in REBOR Ceratosaurus Savage, and like I said in my unboxing video for this skull, I do think it's cool that REBOR have not only created a stylized model of the species, but also an accurate take on the animal's skull, allowing you to display both in tandem with one another as if you have your own shrunk down museum display for a given species. Of course, Savage may not be to everyone's taste, but luckily you can pair this skull with essentially any Ceratosaurus in your collection, unless of course you're a stickler for dentisulcatus models, which I'm uncertain companies have specifically produced. Luckily, I'm not a stickler, so I've gone ahead and brought in the Myuu Ceratosaurus, aka Scavenger, which is actually a personal favorite Ceratosaurus model of mine, right up there with PNSO's massive Nick. And that was the REBOR Ceratosaurus dentisulcatus Skull Oddity, and I genuinely do think this is a beautiful piece. REBOR really did a good job with both the big picture and detail work on this one, and the colors are quite appealing. Even if it wasn't the first one I picked up, I think a strong case could be made that it might just be the best of the bunch. But let's move on to the Yutyrannus hauli skull, and what makes this piece special is it shows just how far REBOR has come in regards to creating models and statues based on Yutyrannus. The glaring errors of their maiden figure have been discussed, pointed out, and complained about ad nauseum, so I won't bother getting into that here. Instead, I'll just focus on their wonderful work on the skull, because once again, they really seem to have captured the overall look of the skull of Yutyrannus hauli, while still being sure to include all of the impeccable weather and cracking detail we saw on the Ceratosaurus skull. One area I'm particularly fond of would be the treatment of the nasal ridge and areas around the antorbitals. It's an interesting treatment, but true to what we see on the skull of Yutyrannus, as the animal did possess that distinct midline crest. Beyond that, the sculpt work looks great across the board from all angles. Every little crack, ridge, imperfection, and anatomical feature has been addressed and accentuated with a dark wash. Once again, I think the work speaks for itself, so I'm going to be quiet for a minute and give you guys a good look from every angle. The jaw is articulated, so you do get that limited range of display options once more. It does open pretty wide to give you a nice gaping display, although I will say this one is even worse than Ceratosaurus when it comes to closing the jaw flush. That's about as far as it will shut, and even then it wants to just float back to a half-open position. But again, hard to complain. I wasn't even anticipating this as being a feature, so appreciate it. I will say one thing I'm not a huge fan of on this one would be the color. I definitely get what they were going for, like a light, earthy tone, but I just think it turned out a bit too yellowed, resulting in an almost diarrhea coloration, which is quite unfortunate. I mean, it's not a terrible color by any means, just the least appealing of the three in my eyes. As far as the length of the piece goes, you're looking at around 4 3/4 inches long, or about 12 centimeters. It also comes in at roughly the same for its height when sitting on that base. Yutyrannus' skull was estimated to be around 35.5 inches long, or about 90 centimeters thereabouts when fully grown, which would put this piece in that 1/7 scale range. However, if you chose to imagine this piece as representing one of the two paratype specimens, it would be roughly 1/6 scale for specimen ZCDM V5001, whose skull measured 31 inches, and roughly 1/5 scale for the juvenile specimen, whose skull came in at around 25 inches. Now, obviously, when it comes to displaying this piece with previous REBOR offerings, the only choice is that poor excuse for Yutyrannus I already mentioned. However, if you're a little more forgiving, you might be able to look at it as less of a scientific display and more as a timeline of REBOR's work, having their humble and misguided beginnings posed next to what is, in my eyes, one of their most noteworthy achievements in recent years. But if you have no patience for such poetic displays, you can of course display it alongside a proper Yutyrannus model like PNSO's recent Ichi, a wonderful interpretation of the species, even if not my personal favorite. This skull also has me excited for the upcoming Beasts of the Mesozoic offering, as I think that beautifully feathered tyrant is going to look absolutely striking alongside this statue. And that was the REBOR Yutyrannus Skull Oddity, another very well done piece, but perhaps my least favorite of the three given the color choice. Still, it's not like it's awful enough to ruin the rest of the work, and I do still enjoy having it on my shelf a good deal. And of course, I saved the best for last. Here is the Carnotaurus sastrei skull, and I absolutely love this thing. One of the main reasons I was drawn to this piece first, outside of the fact that it was my favorite dinosaur, is that between the three, it's the only species I've seen an actual skeletal mount of, at least as far as I can recall. I may have seen a Ceratosaurus at one point in my life, but I'm fairly certain I haven't seen Yutyrannus. So let's just say Carnotaurus is the only one of the three I've seen and actually remember seeing. I saw it as part of some weird dinosaurs traveling museum tour at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science science a couple years back, and it was so amazing to me to finally see a mount of that species. Now it feels like I have a piece of that exhibit in my collection, which is basically the point of this entire line, to have a piece of science and past life on this earth to display in your home. Once again, props to REBOR for creating a very faithful recreation of Carnotaurus' skull. The horn cores might be a bit too narrow and pointed, but beyond that, I look at this thing and I see Carnotaurus. The snout is deep and short, but still narrow from a head-on point of view, and the lower mandible is relatively delicate compared to that upper jaw. Obviously, the detail is just as good as what we got on the previous 3 models, with a very rough, pockmarked, and cracked texture across the entire surface. And the horns feature that weathered texture you'd expect to see on the fossilized cores. The teeth are the smallest of the bunch, and unfortunately mine has suffered a fall and ended up losing a couple of chompers in the process. I managed to reattach 1, maybe 2, but at this scale it was a very messy and imperfect process. So just learn from my mistakes and be sure you're displaying these on a stable surface. They are polystone after all. As far as the paint scheme goes, it's easily the darkest of the bunch with a deep, earthy brown, and I have got mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I don't mind the color at all. It feels appropriate for a skeletal cast, and the darker tones speak to the gothic undertones of the piece. That being said, some of the details are lost to that darker paint and not as immediately noticeable at a distance. Obviously, when you get close, you can still appreciate all that work, and under certain lighting conditions, it does come to life, but it certainly doesn't pop off the shelf like the Ceratosaurus or Yutyrannus do. As far as articulation goes, same situation as the rest. The mouth doesn't fully close, but you can get it open pretty wide. We know Carnotaurus had a fairly kinetic skull, so being able to pose it with that mouth super wide open is a pretty neat touch. As far as the size of the model goes, it is a bit taller than the others, with that deep skull coming in at just under 6 inches off the ground, or around 15 centimeters when on that base. Of course, the deep skull giveth and the deep skull taketh away. It's not as long as the others, only coming in at roughly 4 inches long, or just over 10 centimeters. Carnotaurus' skull was about 23.9 inches long, which would put this piece closest to that 1/6 scale range. As far as older REBOR products to pair with this skull go, you have got their original Carnotaurus Crimson King, which I have actually reviewed on the channel. I know people like to give their Yutyrannus a lot of well-deserved grief, but I think Crimson King kinda coasted under the radar. I have a lot of problems with that figure, but it feels like people tend to look past them because they're not as easy to identify as a Yutyrannus without feathers. I won't get into it here, you can check out my review for that, but suffice it to say, I would much rather display this skull alongside something like the Carnegie Carnotaurus. Even if that's not necessarily a perfect representation, I still think it's one of the better ones, especially in light of its age. Still, if you want something a little more contemporary, I recommend the Collecta Offering or PNSO's recent piece, and if you absolutely must have something from REBOR next to it, go for their recent Crimson King Requiem. That beautiful piece does look good next to this skull, even if it is nowhere near what Carnotaurus was in life. And that was the REBOR Skull Oddity Trio: Ceratosaurus dentisulcatus, Yutyrannus hauli, and Carnotaurus sastrei. I truly believe these are some of the best products REBOR has ever given us. Not only does it feel as though they really tried to be faithful to the actual fossil material, but the technical execution is just immaculate, with every little detail being perfectly rendered to capture the likeness of a scaled-down museum-grade fossil display. If you're a fan of prehistoric life but don't necessarily collect models, then these might be the perfect pieces for you. It's the closest you'll get to having a museum display in your own house for next to no money. I think the most I paid for one was $35 plus shipping, and for the quality of these pieces, that seems more than fair. On the other hand, if you do collect models, displaying these pieces alongside your dinosaurs will inject your setup with an extra layer of scientific and eclectic flair, so really there's no way you could go wrong picking these up. Put them on your mantle, a bookshelf, side table, doesn't matter. If you're a fan of dinosaurs and museums, just put them somewhere in your house. Now, if you wanted to know which one to start with, I think that really does come down to personal tastes and priorities. I mean, for me, obviously, with Carnotaurus being my favorite and the fact that I've actually seen a mount of the species, the choice was simple. But maybe your childhood museum had a Ceratosaurus mount, or your favorite dinosaur is Yutyrannus. That might inform your priorities. But if I take my preferences and biases out of the equation from a purely technical standpoint, I do think the Ceratosaurus is the best of the three. There's something about the combination of the detail and color that just works, and I do think it's the most visually striking of the bunch, so I'm very glad I chose to pull the trigger on it. Regardless, I'm happy to have all of them, and will be eagerly awaiting whatever else REBOR has planned for their Skull Oddity line. So far, an Allosaurus, Dinosuchus, and Sarcosuchus have been completed with no set release date. What a shock. While a Tyrannosaurus Rex and Triceratops sculpt have also been teased. Of course, with REBOR, it could be another several years before we see these products hit retailers, so in the meantime, might as well tide yourselves over with one of these beautiful options. I think in their own way, each is dynamite, and if anything, shows how far REBOR have come as artists. But as always, I want to know what you guys think of these figures. Do you own them yet? Are you planning to pick them up? Which is your favorite? And what kind of skull would you like to see REBOR produce down the line? Personally, I would love to see some hadrosaurs. I feel like a Lambeosaurus skull or Parasaurolophus walkeri. Oh man, that would be epic! Be sure to drop a comment down below, and thank you for hanging with me throughout the month of October. Like I said at the start, Halloween is my all-time favorite holiday, and I'm so glad I finally found a way to reconcile that with Dinosaur so that I could celebrate it properly on the channel. These holiday specials are always a lot of work, but make for a fun way to celebrate the times of the year that I love with people who care about the same things I do. I'm hoping to have some other figures to take a look at next year, but until then, be sure to stay tuned. I'm hoping to review some Nanmu figures in November once again, and of course, Killershrewfan's 12 Days of Reviews is on the horizon. Again? Already? Good God. But until then, happy Halloween, enjoy some candy, put on a good old scary movie of your choice, and indulge yourself in this spookiest of all nights.